Hello and welcome. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX. In a significant development, Hamas has named 6 Israeli captives: Elia Cohen, Omer Shemtov, Omer Venkert, Tal Shahom Avera, Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed, who are set to be released this Saturday in exchange for 602 Palestinian prisoners, including 50 serving life sentences. However, tensions are escalating after Israel accused Hamas of violating the Gaza ceasefire agreement, claiming the body of a female captive, Shiri Bibas, was misidentified. The remains returned by Hamas were said to be those of other captives, including 2 children, Ariel and Kafir Bibas, and 83-year-old Oded Lifshitz. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has demanded the return of all remaining hostages, living or dead, while Israel vows to hold Hamas accountable. The controversy is fueling anger and could potentially reignite military action, although experts warn that it might undermine future exchanges. We're joined by several guests to discuss the ever-evolving situation in the Middle East. Joining us first is Ali M. Abushbak, an independent Palestinian researcher in Cairo. We're also joined by Adrian Calamel, a terrorism scholar and fellow at the Arabian Peninsula Institute, joining us from New York. We have Jordan Cope, a political expert, joining us from the United States. And finally, Elizabeth Laris, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Indo-Pacific Security Initiative from Washington, D.C. Jordan Cope, I'd like to come to you first and look at the situation with the deceased hostage release that we've seen. Is this something that you think is a major sort of blow for the trust in Israel around this ceasefire deal? And do you think that if the body is returned, then we can get back on track towards the second phase?
I would like to mention, I do think this is a major breach of trust. I don't think any trust with Hamas previously existed, but the details emerging are amongst the most horrific I've ever heard. News is now reporting coming out of Israel by Amit Segal and other Israelis that apparently the Bibas children, the red-headed children, were actually killed with bare hands by the captives who were holding them within Gaza. I mean, the details that are emerging are just more and more Nazi-like. The coffins, when they were released yesterday, were paraded by Hamas, PIJ and Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade members in front of cheering crowds with celebratory music in the background. It's one of the most horrific things I've ever seen in my life. And whereas the Nazis tried to shield the public from the atrocities that they committed, Hamas and the leadership in Gaza seems to be parading and celebrating and glorifying the murder of these innocent babies. And not only was a baby, were 2 young children, essentially babies, discovered to have been killed, but another one of the hostages was a peace activist. Symbolically, I can't imagine anything worse, killing babies and killing a peace activist. What is the message that Hamas is trying to send to the world, especially after Israel removed all of its troops from the Netzarim corridor, which is one of the biggest conditions that Hamas asked for in the ceasefire agreement. And yet now we don't even know what happened to the mother of the Bibas children. Hamas returned back a corpse belonging to somebody who couldn't even be identified as one of the hostages. It's one of the most horrific things I've ever seen. Israel has promised revenge. The question is, when will that occur? Likely after some more of the hostages have been released. But the sad reality is that Hamas is parading as if it has won this tragic war. And what Israel ultimately needs to do is to send a message to Hamas that it hasn't, either by more high-profile assassinations of Hamas leaders, or perhaps more importantly, re-engaging the territory and temporarily seizing more territory, because every time Israel withdraws, Hamas parades and claims that it has indeed repelled Israel from the territory. The sad reality is, since 2005, when Israel removed all of its troops from the Gaza Strip and hoped that peace would emerge, that vision has ultimately failed. And what we've seen is a radicalization of the Gaza Strip in a manner that makes me reminisce of extremism that we learn about in Nazi Germany.
Yes, Adrian, building on from that, of course, we have heard that Hamas is set to release 6 alive hostages this weekend. However, the feeling in Israel, of course, will be one that is conflicted. How do you think that diplomacy can resume after the scenes that have been described there by Jordan?
Well, thank you, Joshua, for the question. Diplomacy with Hamas, I just don't think that works, just as diplomacy with the Taliban doesn't work. Diplomacy for them is not something they play by. They are terrorists. They're a terrorist organization. And we have to remember, when it comes down to it, terrorism is a political act, all right? It's directly targeting civilians, and it's to terrorize the population. It's to terrorize Israelis. It's to put more pressure on the Israeli government. It's to continue to mount pressure. And we have to also remember that hostages, the holding of the hostages, has always been leverage for Hamas. Hamas knows when they give up all those bodies and they continue to break rules of war, Antonio Gutierrez, who was no friend of Israel, came out yesterday and condemned the parading and the basically a rock star music show celebration when they're handing over dead corpses of children. So it's, this is a situation where I don't know if we get to Saturday. I don't know. Hamas is already saying that they want Israel to repatriate the dead remains of whatever was sent to them. So they're putting demands on having, because they covered it up, didn't send Shiri Bibas over in the exchange, and now they're demanding the request of the Palestinian remains to be returned that were in the coffin to shield this. And the one other thing is we have to also look that I don't think we can disconnect the series of bombings last night from this whole incident. Were these at all coordinated? Was this Hamas knowing that this was coming, that they were blowing up this ceasefire arrangement by turning it into a propaganda act and then blatantly trying to mislead people by sending the wrong body?
Yes, and we of course wait to see the reaction from Benjamin Netanyahu, not just for the body that's been returned not being that of Shiri Bibas, but also, as you mentioned there, the bombs that were blown up, or the buses that were blown up by bombs last night. But Ali, I'd like to come to you and look at the impact that could happen now for the people living in Gaza, the Palestinians. Do you think that the actions that we've seen in the last 24 hours are going to potentially push Palestinians away from Hamas? This is potentially, almost definitely, a provocation if it is true, and it could see action back in Gaza directly as a result of what Hamas have done. So in your understanding, what's the perception of that amongst many Palestinians?
Thank you for having me. In fact, it's not only Hamas who's violated the agreement. The ceasefire agreement. Also, Israel. There is reported more than 350 violations from Israelis troops in Gaza. Either they are killing or shooting the Palestinian. They are carrying out by Israeli drone or by gun. The things is in Gaza, people, after they were optimistic about the progress to move on second phase of the negotiation between Hamas and Israel. Nowadays, everyone got shocked about this statement and about that announcement that the bodies it's not related to the Israeli body because it's got mixed with other Palestinian bodies or remain body. Things is more complicated, but I guess Hamas is not interested to go back to the war, especially they has a huge loss during the war. They got lost their supreme leader, Mohammed al-Taif. They got lost a lot of the first front of leader from Hamas, and as well as people from Gaza. They sacrificed a lot during the war. There is more than 60% of Gaza Strip they got damaged. The infrastructure and the buildings. So people are not hoping to go and to return to the war since they are optimistic about moving for second phases of the negotiation. And this is what the American special of Middle East. His name is
Witkoff.
Kitov, I guess. Yeah, with Tov. Yesterday he released a statement that he's optimist about the progress in the negotiation. So on the ground, I guess Hamas is starting their investigation about this remaining death body, and they will find some solution. And there is a mediator who's Qatar and Egypt. They are on the loop that about what is happening and how it's that got mixed between with other death bodies.
Jordan, I'd like to come back to you and get your response to what Ali said, but also looking at that optimism from the US. Do you think that optimism has now gone?
I don't think there is much optimism from the US. I mean, Trump made it very clear that Hamas was the main party in violation of the ceasefire and that they shouldn't be releasing hostages in drips and drabs, threatening to withhold them, not releasing the names of the hostages in a timely manner, firing a rocket towards Israel. It's ultimately been Hamas that's been in violation of the ceasefire, and there are still Israeli troops in Gaza, just at a much lesser scale. The fact that Israeli troops have fired back doesn't necessarily mean that it's violated a ceasefire. Israeli troops should not be sitting ducks in Gaza and simply being shot at with no means of response. It's been very clear who's been in violation of this ceasefire agreement. It's been Hamas. And this agreement wouldn't have even needed to have been in place had Hamas not illegally kidnapped over 250 Israelis on October 7th, an entire and utter violation of international law. The attempt to conflate Israel with Hamas is a propaganda game of those affiliated with terrorist movements that seek to undermine Israel's existence by trying to portray it on equal moral ground with Hamas. And it's one that must be dispelled immediately.
Elizabeth Laris, thank you for your patience while you've waited there. I'd like to look at the impact of Donald Trump and now look at what his role may be in trying to repair this ceasefire deal and at least bring us closer towards the second stage and negotiations towards that. But also with his thoughts and his plans for the Riviera of the Middle East in mind, how do you think he looks at the reaction that will come from Israel? And do you think that he will support that reaction depending on what it is?
I believe his initial reaction is a tremendous amount of anger. The ceremony that Hamas carried out in handing over the bodies was a demonstration of both hate and of strength. When Hamas has handed over hostages, when they did the exchanges previously, there was a tremendous presence of Hamas militants as well as civilians, surprising the United States and even the Israeli government with how much support there still is for Hamas. And so Hamas, and having this celebratory handover of human remains, not only violates international law, but it was intended as a form of psychological warfare to demoralize Israelis who would put more pressure on their government to get the remaining hostages out. President Trump, my understanding is most recently is very angry. And, you know, ironically, when he said that he wanted to develop Gaza, of course, he was scorned. It was laughable. This recent action actually makes it a little bit more, I wouldn't say palatable. People are, I think, agreeing a little bit more with this. I think it's going to be a very difficult thing to do because Hamas is still strong and it's not going to let President Trump develop Gaza. So I think Trump, on the one hand, can say, yeah, this is going to be a great thing we can do. And people, the Palestinians, can live in Gaza with dignity. But the reality, I believe, is going to be very different.
Adrian, coming back to you, looking at a potential escalation and looking at a potential resumption in fighting, there is, of course, action going on in the West Bank as well. What really do you think needs to be done to avoid, again, returning back to all-out war?
Oh, another great question, Joshua. I mean, the biggest thing from day one has been the return of all the hostages. That just simply hasn't happened. That's how you end this war. My fear is that, and we've known this for a while, although no one's really been paying attention to it, that Hamas is in the West Bank. It runs the West Bank. You know, people can say the Palestinian Authority has control, but let's be honest, Hamas has enormous strength in the West Bank. And my fear is that another front opens there. We also have to look at there were strikes last night carried out by the Israeli Air Force in Homs, Syria, border, in western Syria, which may be related to the movement of some weapons into those areas. I think the region is on a knife's edge. And if you look at last night's bombing, if we look back at October 7th, we have to remember that it was started with a volley or salvo of rockets being fired, and then as a distraction, and then all of a sudden the rush came, the flood came. And the fear is that, is this coming from another direction? Is this being planned from another direction? Is this possibly being planned in the West Bank? Was last night a failure in this because someone forgot to put on the AM to the PM or the PM to the AM? And that's the only reason that Israel luckily survived, because it wasn't just buses. The light transit was also being targeted. It was a mass casualty attack targeting the transportation network. So I'm very fearful of what's going to happen. I wish I had something better to say and could be more positive.
Ali, coming to you, I do want to focus on the strikes that we've seen in the West Bank. A report today has come out that 220 children have been killed in the West Bank in recent times. Of course, not all of these people and not all of the people killed throughout this war have been affiliated with Hamas. So moving forward and looking towards trying to solve this issue as opposed to looking at it as a confrontation between everyone in the West Bank and Gaza and Israel, how can the people, the Palestinian people, make sure that they're not caught up in this war and that we're not seeing children dying at the hands of military action that's targeting specifically terrorists?
Well, it's a very important question. I think after the ceasefire in Gaza, Benjamin Netanyahu tried to transform the war in West Bank, which showing that his aggressive mentality against the Palestinian. Why this happened? Because Benjamin Netanyahu want to end the last dream for Palestinians to establish their state, their state, Palestinian state. So what is happening you are talking about that Israel just only targeting military group and militant people. What about the displacement, the people, the civilians, who more than 13,000 of Palestinians who displaced from the Jenin refugee camp? And from many places from West Bank. So I guess that unusual that accusation between Palestinian and Israel. This is a zero-sum game. So we are looking forward to the progress of peace and to the end such kind of conflict for better future for the children, for the coming generation. But here justifying the action, finding any excuses and put the blame on other. This is it will not give you any result, since that it will escalate the violence on the ground. So. Killing civilians from both sides, like I said yesterday, it's heartbreaking for Palestinian and for Israeli as well as civilian and innocent shouldn't be under the fire of the military. And what's happening also in Gaza, more than 48,000 of people, they were civilians, they were innocent, they didn't involve in the conflict military. But their crime, it was just only they are from Gaza. So if you want to make a balance, you should then just only take one side and adopting the narrative of one side and leaving, putting your back for the other side of the other people who deserve the life, who deserve to be living in their dignity. So this is the main things. This is that's making the conflict more complicated. Since I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not about politicians, it's about the existence. Both sides of Palestine and Israel fighting for their existence. So to find a solution, we shouldn't put a blame and we shouldn't find an excuses to kill more and more civilians or more and more innocent people.
Jordan Cope, I'd like to look now at the number of Palestinian prisoners that are set to be released. It's expected that it's going to be potentially over 600, with around 50 of those sentenced to life in prison. What's the risk that that poses to the Israeli people?
I think the risk is a significant one. Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind behind the October 7th attacks, was, and I don't know why Ali's smiling in the background, but Yahya Sinwar, one of them released, was actually saved in an Israeli hospital by an Israeli operator giving him surgery when he had cancer. And he was eventually released back to Gaza and ultimately planned and committed the October 7th attack, which killed over 1,200 people. There are it's a significant risk. Many of these people who have already been released have had life sentences, had killed multiple people, some upwards of 30 innocent people in Israel. I want to talk about some of the statistics that were recently mentioned. There was a claim that 48,000 innocent people have been killed in Gaza. I'm looking at Al Jazeera, one of the most biased sources on the conflict, which notes that 46,000 people had died and they weren't all necessarily civilians. Israel claims that roughly at least 20,000, 17 to 20,000 of those killed in Gaza were not civilians. And John Spencer, a mastermind when it comes to military studies, has noted that Israel has conducted its war in a manner that far exceeds the standards of protecting civilians in other wars worldwide. It's remarkable how many civilians Israel has spared in its operations. And according to Jeffrey Korn from JINSA, who noted on a recent webinar that Israel suspended approximately 50% of all of its airstrikes. At the same time, Israel's allowed over 1 million tons of aid into the Gaza Strip. So these claims that Israel is targeting civilians, absolutely ridiculous. Israel has done more to restrain itself in this war, to ensure that civilian to combatant ratios are amongst the lowest in recent modern day warfare. And in addition, it should be noted that Hamas doesn't have age requirements when it recruits its terrorists in Gaza, and 47% of Gaza's population is under the age of 18, which probably explains why a lot of Gaza soldiers who have been killed in this war perhaps were under that 18-year threshold. But Israel giving humanitarian aid, more so than many other countries in recent memory, despite 60% of all that aid in Rafah alone being siphoned by Hamas, meaning that Israel doesn't have to provide it under international law, goes to show the true extent that Israel has gone to protect and preserve Palestinian life, while Hamas neglects it entirely.
Elizabeth Laris, I want to end this discussion looking forward now. Of course, this is an extremely divisive discussion and topic. Despair and death on both sides have been a constant theme throughout the 15 or so months that this war has raged on for. In your eyes, how do we move forward? But also, I want to look at the role that the geopolitical players can have in this. We know that, of course, that the Arab nations are set to meet to propose a plan that's different to Donald Trump's, but do you think there's a possibility that everyone could get down and sit at the table and a real agreement can be made, or is it a dire situation where the reality is we're looking at further conflict?
Well, it depends on who's sitting at the table and what they're bringing to the table. Hamas's platform, its manifesto, is extinguishing Israel. Hamas does not recognize the right of Israel to exist. And so their reason for existing is to destroy Israel. So if they're at the table, I can't imagine there's going to be a lot of progress. Now, what I thought was interesting is the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, Abdul Aziz al-Sheikh. He came out, he condemned that handover ceremony of the remains yesterday, and he used very strong words. He said that it was a disgrace to Islam and an act of blasphemy against Allah. And he's not the only cleric who has come out and condemned Hamas's actions. And so perhaps if more of the clerics say you are using, you're carrying out violence in the name of religion, you're using religion to carry out your violent agenda, and start to really condemn this, it may influence parties in the Middle East, and then maybe we'll see some progress.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. Also, thank you to Jordan, Adrian and Ali for joining us. Of course, this situation brings despair and sadness to many across the world, but we will be here to bring you all of the updates as we move towards a potential ceasefire phase 2. For now, that's it. Thank you.